Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And on today's episode, we're finding out about the world of medieval music, the kind you might hear being played in the grounds of Alnwick Castle during your visit.
We spoke to Trouvere, a very talented duo of medieval musicians who make regular appearances here at the castle, to find out more about their music, the instruments that were used hundreds of years ago, and how medieval music has survived into the 21st century.
You'll also hear a few excerpts from some of their recent performances in the grounds of Alnwick Castle.
Please enjoy. So we are here in the grounds of Alnwick Castle in a medieval tent with Paul and Gill, also known as Trouvere the Medieval Minstrels. How are you both today?
We're very well, thank you, Daniel.
Great, thanks, Daniel.
So I'd like to start out by asking, how do you become a medieval musician?
I sometimes ask myself that same question, how you end up being a medieval minstrel. I studied music, that was my thing some 25 years ago. And I became increasingly interested in earlier music, especially medieval music. There's something about medieval music that caught my attention, and once it had caught it, never let go.
I was a little bit different because although I did lots of music when I was a youngster, I kind of gave that up and moved into acting a lot more instead. But then ended up studying lots of medieval history. So I ended up in York doing my PhD and met Paul because we were working at the same museum. Got interested in what he was doing. I started off doing storytelling with the group, but inevitably ended up getting into the music as well. So I suppose I come at it from the historical point. I just find it incredibly satisfying to get some idea of the sounds and the things that medieval people enjoyed.
What is it about the music of that period that you find the most enjoyable and the most interesting?
Knew they were going to ask that. Are you ready for this, Paul?
Well, without going into any theory, basically medieval music it's constructed on a slightly different pattern to how we might approach music nowadays. It's what we call modal music, and I don't worry too much about knowing what that is, except that in other parts of the world there are still modal musics in the folk music, like in the Middle East and in India, and it tends to be very melody oriented and rhythm oriented as well, although for medieval music rhythm's a little trickier because that's one of the persistent problems in medieval notation that they struggled to get down in their manuscripts because they couldn't write notation very well until the 13th century. And even then, it was a little bit problematic. But modal music, melody-oriented, with curious scales, interesting scales, are a little bit different in lots of subtle ways that, again, I won't get into any detail with, that made it stand out for me.
You mentioned manuscripts. Is that how this music has survived into the 21st century? Was it written down as sheet music in a form that we'd recognise, or how do we know what it was meant to sound like?
It's a fascinating story, the story of notation in the medieval West, because it's a developing story right the way through the medieval period. So if you go right back into a few centuries before the conquest, they are notating music in church settings, but it can be very, very hard to decipher. And indeed, if you didn't know it was meant to represent music, you wouldn't know, you wouldn't be able to tell. But by the time we get especially into definitely by the 12th century, the music is definitely recognisable as music. There's a stave in almost all cases, so maybe not 5 lines, but maybe 4 lines with the notes, the dots arranged on those lines. And then, as time goes on, as Paul said, they work out different ways of notating the rhythm of the piece. And then by the time we get to the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century, it looks almost the same as it does nowadays. So the further back you go, the more educated guesswork there is really. But there's a lot written down about the theory of music in medieval times as well. Those monks were busily writing about what music should be and how it should be played. So that can give us some really useful pointers as well in interpreting the dots on the page. There are literally thousands of pieces of medieval music. Thousands. We are never going to run out.
What about the people who played the music, so the musicians, the minstrels? What was their status at medieval times? Were they respected for their work?
It's a bit of both. That's a really fascinating one, because music was a pursuit for the wealthy and aristocratic, definitely. If we just imagine in a really simple way the days before there was any electricity or any, we have the ability to just produce music whenever we want it. They didn't have that. So if you were able to make music by singing or maybe by playing an instrument as well, then this was a good head start among your social scene. It was definitely an admirable thing to be able to do. And if you go back to the 12th, 13th century, we have the troubadours and trouvères of respectively southern and northern France, and they were by and large aristocratic, and it was a huge thing for them to write their own pieces of music, to write their own songs and to perform them, or to have professional performers perform them for them. So that's right, top high status, and a king or a queen or a lord or a lady would likely have some experience of music making and some knowledge of music. And then it goes right down to the other end of the scale, and basically if you end up getting paid for making your music, then you are less respectable. So one of the earliest attested female musicians was Guilelma Monja, the wife of a troubadour, and he played and she sang, but she's described as a soldadera in the manuscript, which means paid woman, which doesn't have the best connotations, I don't know. So yeah, that's the bottom scale. These are the people that might scratch a bare living going from festival to festival around the place. And because they were moving around a lot and they didn't have a fixed place of abode and a fixed lord, then they might be viewed as vagabonds, so it was not necessarily a respectable thing to do. So it really does cover the whole gamut, a musical term, from extreme disrespectability to uttermost respectability.
Troubadour is a word that you've just used. That's a word that still gets used with musicians today, but a trouvère is something we're probably less familiar with. Can you explain what a trouvère is and how you chose to name yourselves that?
Yes, well, the word troubadour first. If we just go with that one first, and then it's much easier to explain what trouvères are. But we have a slightly skewed notion of what a troubadour is or was, because nowadays we can use troubadour to mean just a guy who plays a guitar. We'll sometimes style them a troubadour, won't we? Like Bob Dylan or something like that. But a troubadour in the past was, as Jill was saying, an aristocratic musician. By that, I don't necessarily mean that they were themselves aristocrats, but they were presented amongst aristocrats as though they were aristocrats. And we know of one troubadour who's like raised from the ranks. But he was brought upstairs, he's put in nice clothes, and he effectively becomes a lord, even though his father, we're not quite sure exactly what his job was, but we think his father was a baker in the castle. So it was a rags to riches story for this guy, Bernat de Ventadour, and he then tours in the entourage of kings and queens, and he comes to England, he travels all over the place, but because he's not a lord, at the end of his life, he goes to a monastery. He's not going to go where the other lords and ladies go, and retire in a castle or in a posh house somewhere. He goes to the monastery at the end of his time. But he has a good life. And he's a troubadour, and troubadours create their music in Occitan. That's the language. It's the language of southern France. And the only real difference between troubadours and trouvères, effectively, is that the trouvères compose in northern French language. but they have exactly the same sort of role and function in the aristocratic society in the north. However, there is a couple of differences. It sounds like Jill wants to tell you one of them.
No, I was wanting to tell you something that was the same actually, because the words are the same in Occitan and Northern French. So troubadour in Occitan and trouvere in Northern French, they both mean he who finds, or she who finds, one who finds. So there's the idea that they are finding their music as an inspiration, an idea of inspiration coming to them. And there is a little bit of a difference because the troubadours were very noble kind of connotations to almost all of them, and people like Bernard would be, as Paul said, counted amongst the nobility if they proved themselves as a troubadour. But in the trouvères, who are operating a little bit later than the troubadours and picking up their ideas from the troubadours, they end up a little bit more bourgeois, as they would say then, so not necessarily noble, and you get a few more who are just professional musicians coming from tradesmen's ranks, if you like, or high tradesmen's ranks, but there wasn't so much of an expectation that you would be a noble if you were a trouvère. How did you choose the name, Paul?
Do you know? Well, it's just slightly. I mean, I'd like to say that I was inspired by the trouvères and I knew all about them when I picked the name, but I just went on what sounded really cool. When I was at university studying medieval history, and I encountered that word, trouvère. I mean, the French, when they pronounce it, they growl the R. But as far as we know, that R wasn't growled in the 12th and 13th century. So if we say trouvère, we can get away with that. Yeah.
Trouvère.
Trouvère. Yeah. And I like the word, and that's simply why I adopted it. And there were other bands already called troubadour. And you know, we just have the same name as some of the other bands. So we went with their northern counterparts.
Nice. You are a northerner.
I am a northerner.
Now, you mentioned castles, and obviously we are in a castle here. How important was music to medieval life in castles and in these kind of environments?
I think it was massively important. The ability to have music when you wanted it was a prerogative of the noble classes, and it was a really important part of their courtly, gentle lifestyle, that they could enjoy music when they wanted to. So, as well as making music themselves, which I'm sure was a very important part, we know of numerous named nobles who were troubadours or trouvères. As well as that, they would have the ability to employ professional musicians. And even though these were paid musicians, they weren't necessarily very low status. If they were in the right kind of household and they stayed attached to that household, then that would have prestige. And yeah, they were able to, in the evenings, after a hard day's jousting or whatever, or a hard day's fighting or a hard day's general oppression of the peasantry, they could sit down and either make music themselves or listen to music, and it would have been hugely important. There's a really nice story of King Canute. So this is before the conquest, and he's being rowed by his men in the fens near Ely. So, you know, he's being rowed through the as yet undrained fens, and they are going past Ely Abbey, and the monks inside the abbey are singing. And think of Canute, we think Danish king, you know, with a bunch of Vikings rowing him around, you know. And the story goes, it's a medieval story, that Canute said to his men, "Let us row again around this abbey, my men, because I want to hear the monks sing." And that kind of expresses for me how very precious the music could be in the days before music is just there for everyone all the time. And nowadays it is. It's there so much that we don't notice it half the time, and which is a shame in some ways. We've gained a lot, but we've kind of lost some of that appreciation of music as well, I think.
Mentioned French music, and we've talked about castles which cropped up all over England after the Norman conquest, but a lot of the tunes you play here at Alnwick are Spanish or they're Italian or Sicilian in origin. So medieval music, was that different in different countries? Would you expect to hear something totally different in Spain or Italy than you might in an English castle here in Northumberland?
There's doubtlessly going to be some regional variation, and that will happen with the instruments as well. However, the theory of music seems to be pretty well shared all around Europe. It's sort of borrowed from Arabic texts and from Byzantine texts, and somewhat garbled. The medieval writers didn't fully understand what they got, but they created something else instead, and what they created is amazing, because those medieval monks, 1,200 years ago, 1,400 years ago, they created the music that becomes what we've got today as well. And this happens all around Europe. So whether it's in Spain, Italy, France, Germany, or England, all these different places are sharing from this same pool of music. But regional variation, we really like some of the Spanish tunes, and we play them a lot here, perhaps partly to summon a bit of sun, but also because there just happen to be some great collections from the 13th century, all hymns to the Virgin Mary, but they're stomping tunes, and there's over 400 of them. It's a great mine of music for us to delve into, and we inevitably find ourselves choosing from that particular repertoire, and they're lovely, and they have their own quality, which sounds different to the troubadours and trouvères, but only in a subtle way, I think. It's the sort of thing that I might notice for a listener who's not especially used to listening to medieval music. They might not necessarily hear too much of a difference, except in the choice of language. It's Galician Portuguese, isn't it, for these Spanish ones?
Yes. So thinking about how it might be different to what you would hear in a castle in Northumbria and a castle in Andalusia or something, then there would be differences, and I think the instrumentation is a really important part of that. So around the Mediterranean, they are in much earlier contact and much more sustained contact with the Muslim cultures of North Africa and the Middle East, and that is a really, really rich musical tradition there. And in particular, there are instruments that were known in the Islamic world that weren't at the same date known in Western and Northern Europe in particular. So we see during the course of the Middle Ages some of those instruments becoming more and better known in Western Europe. But early on and right the way through the medieval period, if you were in Sicily or if you were in Andalusia, then you would hear the frame drums of the Arabs. You would hear more bowed sounds earlier on. You would hear the trumpets and the reedy sounds, and those kind of sounds came in earliest to southern and eastern Europe, and slowly made their way further and further north. So it might take a bit of a while for the exciting, fruity sounds of the frame drums to get up to Northumbria, but they would have made it by the end of the medieval period, certainly.
One thing that affects instrument choice as well as humidity, and we get a bit of it up here in Northumbria, and they get less of it in Spain. So some things are going to work better there than they do here. Another instrument to mention, being as we've been talking about Spain, the guitar really gets rooted in Spain quite a lot, and manuscripts, especially the Cantigas de Santa Maria, the one we were talking about before with over 400 tunes, and there are illustrations in there showing several different kinds of guitar, including a couple like I've got with me today, guitars and citoles and lutes. These sorts of things are magnificent instruments introduced into Spain, as Jill says, from North Africa. They're certainly not indigenous to Spain. These things are coming from the Middle East originally. So yes, as you say, things slowly spread through. One instrument though that we can place to some degree in the northwest of Europe is the harp.
Yeah, the harp is perhaps the most significant instrument that appears to have arisen in the northwest of Europe. So the earliest images of the kind of harp that we think of as the European classical harp these days, the earliest images of that type are found on stone crosses, carvings on stone crosses from very north of England and up into Scotland as far as kind of Perth and that kind of level. They're called Pictish crosses, these crosses, for no particular good reason as far as we can see. But several of these crosses show a human figure playing a harp. It's almost certainly meant to be King David, because that was the way you showed it was King David, right the way through medieval art, because he's playing an instrument. And those date back to the 9th century. And the harp would certainly have been well known in Northumbria as early as the 9th, 10th century. I'm fairly confident about that.
In terms of your music, what are your maybe more famous pieces that you play, or your favourite pieces that you play?
My favourites, again, I probably come back to the music of Trouveres and the Cantigas de Santa Maria. Those are my two go-tos. In the Trouvere repertoire, there's a selection of instrumental pieces that survive, which are quite rare. They're nearly all songs otherwise. But these instrumental pieces are great because it's a notion of dance music from the 13th century, and they're really, really jolly, sweet tunes, and I like to play them, and they're my favourites. They're not necessarily the ones that go down best with our listeners. Probably they're a little complicated, but if for people that listen to our music, we notice one of the tunes that we play that has gotten the most attention. It's quite irritatingly not medieval at all. It's a Tudor piece of music from the time of Henry VIII, and called Dance of the Washwomen. And it's a jolly tune, and we like it, but we're trying to promote medieval music.
Was medieval music to dance to, or was it purely religious? Was it something that you could move about to, and how was that different to what we'd imagine dancing to music is now?
Yes, excellent question. So the vast majority of medieval music that survives is religious music associated with the church, but there is a lot of secular music as well. And in both these settings, we know that there's dancing going on. It might sound a bit surprising, but it's clear that some monks could get quite jiggy in the choir stalls. And we know this because there are repeated admonitions coming down from the Vatican, like saying, "And you will not dance during Mass." So part of being a monk or a nun is music is hugely important. I mean, repeatedly every day, the most important part of your life is to raise your voice in glory to God. So music would be such a key part of a monk's existence, and I'm sure that many of them developed a huge musical sense, and they would, if it felt like it, they might well move and bring even more expression to their music by dancing. And they had the excuse that King David in the Old Testament, he danced before the Lord. So if they did feel the inclination to do this, they could kind of go, David. But it wasn't officially approved of. So there was that happening. And then there are numerous references to the ordinary folk dancing as well, mostly written by churchmen, because churchmen had literacy earlier and more thoroughly than other medieval people. So these accounts of people dancing are almost always written by churchmen, and they are not approving of this dancing going on. There would be shocking things happening, like young men and women dancing through the churchyard. That would be terrible. But yeah, there is a dance called a carol. And although we can't be exactly sure how the carol was danced, it's clear that it was the kind of dance that could involve literally hundreds of people, and a whole community joining together in an expression of dance was something that happened a lot in medieval times. And again, in the aristocratic setting, dancing, very, very important. There were accounts of jousts, and they would go into a lot of detail about what happened during the day, and the men on their horses and da-da-da-da, bash him, and all that kind of thing. But as much detail about what went on in the evening when there would be dancing and singing of the aristocrats entertaining themselves. Some fascinating accounts of women dancing on their own or with a female partner, cross-dressing in their dancing, which is perhaps the last thing that you might expect a medieval woman to do, to be dressing up as a man, especially an aristocratic woman. But yeah, all these things went on and were part of the dance culture of the Middle Ages. I'm not sure how it would be like the dancing nowadays. I think I'm too old to talk with any confidence about how people dance nowadays. But we know that medieval people enjoyed dancing.
What's it like for you to play somewhere like Alnwick Castle nowadays?
Oh, it's brilliant. You know, to be out on this field, right by this keep, one of the most magnificent spots in England. You can't go wrong, can you?
Yeah, one of the best things about being a medieval minstrel is the amazing places that you get to play. It's perfect, isn't it? Really, you know, it's better than being stuck in an office, I suppose.
Yeah.
A quick question before we finish. If you had to pick one medieval instrument, what's your favourite?
It's a fairly quick choice for me. For me, that's going to be medieval guitars. I've got several, and if I pick just one of my medieval guitars, it will be my guitarn.
For me, it's my medieval harp, and probably most of all my early medieval harp, the one that was known in this part of the world in the early part of the medieval period.
Lovely. So in terms of your music and where you will be appearing, where can people find more about Trouvere?
Most people nowadays tend to interact with us through Facebook if they're doing it online, and you can find us on Facebook. But also, if you fancy listening to any of our sounds, you can stream us as well. And so if you have like a Spotify or Apple Music, you can go there and effectively the music's free to listen to, you know, if you've already got an account.
We're terribly modern minstrels, really. But yeah, available in streaming. We have a YouTube channel as well, and our website is medievalminstrels.com.
The first medieval minstrels to have a website, maybe?
Well, I managed to snag medievalminstrels.com. So I did jump relatively early, but I'm sure some other people got onto the internet before I did. I'm a bit of a Luddite, in all honesty, so I surprised myself getting that domain name.
Well, Paul and Gill, thank you both very much for joining us on the Alnwick Castle podcast today, and possibly to play us out, maybe we can hear a little bit of a couple of those stringed instruments we can see behind you here in the grounds.
Very good. Here we go. So this is from the cantiga. It's one of the cantigas.
It's the first. It's number one.
Number one in the book, yeah. We won't work for all 400.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from Trouvere and enjoyed hearing some of the music they play. Keep checking alnwickcastle.com for news of their upcoming performances here at the castle. If you want to hear a little more Alnwick Castle music, please go back and listen to episode 25 of the podcast, The Northumbrian Pipes.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you get every new episode as it's released. Please recommend the Alnwick Castle podcast to your friends, and we'd be grateful for any positive reviews or ratings you can leave us.
Join us in 2 weeks as we look at another aspect of Alnwick Castle's history. Until then, I've been Deborah.
And I've been Daniel.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.